At its peak in the 13th century, the Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in history. It stretched over 24 million square kilometers from East Asia to Eastern Europe, ruling over a quarter of the global population at the time. Founded in 1206 by the visionary leader and ruthless conqueror Genghis Khan, the Mongol Empire would achieve unprecedented territorial growth at incredible speed. Cities that resisted Mongol expansion were razed to the ground, and others were threatened with annihilation unless they capitulated. The Mongols instilled widespread fear, making use of a highly disciplined military that was expert in horseback warfare, sieges, and incorporating technology from conquered peoples. The Mongols revitalized the Silk Road, improving the infrastructure of this ancient trade route, and encouraged religious tolerance and cultural exchange. At its peak, contemporaries viewed the Mongol Empire as an invincible force. In Europe and the Middle East, the Mongols were often described in apocalyptic terms, perceiving their conquests as divine punishment for humanity's sins. The empire seemed destined to conquer indefinitely, but like all empires in history, the Mongol Empire would fall. The largest contiguous land empire known to humanity would disintegrate. Loss of territory, economic collapse, and social upheaval would turn the once great empire destined to conquer the world into a shell of its former self. How did it happen? An empire so powerful, seen as invincible, the very mention of which struck fear into people's hearts. How did it collapse? In order to understand, we need to go back to the year 1227. It's late summer and the Mongols are waging a campaign against the Tangut Kingdom, a regional power in the area of modern-day northern China. Just a few days before the fall of the Tangut, Genghis Khan dies. Little is known about his death, and even today it remains the subject of much speculation. A procession heads out towards Mongolia, with the Great Khan's body on a simple cart, followed by a horse with Genghis Khan's empty saddle. Unease is in the air. As subdued as the procession is, Genghis Khan's passing will have a thunderous impact on the Mongol Empire that'll be felt for years to come. By the time Genghis Khan died, the Mongol Empire stretched as far as northern China in the east to the Caspian Sea in the west. Expansion would continue into China, the Middle East, and even penetrating as far as Central Europe, but cracks were already beginning to show. Prior to Genghis Khan's death, he had brought all 4 of his sons to a campaign in Central Asia, hoping they could learn to live and work together. He was in his 60s, and succession was on his mind. As he planned it, the empire would be divided among each son, each having their own territory, but deferring to a single great Khan. In a family Kuriltai, a gathering to discuss succession, 2 sons, Jochi and Chagatai, got into a physical brawl, insulting and striking each other. Ogadai, the 3rd son of Genghis Khan, was eventually chosen as successor, but Genghis Khan knew that the preservation of the empire was at risk. He tried his best to instill the need for cohesion, and while his sons may have openly respected his decision, it was becoming increasingly clear his wishes for harmony would be ignored. In 1225, Genghis Khan's eldest son Jochi mysteriously died, and when Ogadai assumed control of the empire, various recently conquered territories broke away and refused to send tribute. The first succession of power would be a forewarning of the difficulties to come. Kuriltai were assemblies of Mongol leaders where the next Khan was typically chosen through a combination of deliberation and consensus. In theory, this was meant to achieve cohesion, but instead, it became a platform for rivalry. The Mongols didn't adopt a system of primogeniture, the automatic inheritance of leadership by the eldest son. Instead, all sons of the ruling family were potential heirs, a recipe for tension and power struggles. The resulting political instability and distractions due to internal power struggles played into the hands of the Mongols' enemies. Ogadai Khan's death in 1241 and the resulting succession crisis led to the Mongol withdrawal of Europe. These internal conflicts drained resources and prevented coordinated campaigns, and by the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire began to fragment into smaller, semi-independent states. When Mongke Khan died in 1259 with no declared successor, infighting escalated into a war of succession known as the Toluid Civil War, pitting Kublai Khan against his younger brother, Arik Boka. By the time Kublai Khan emerged victorious in 1264, there was no heading back. Other Khans failed to attend his Kuriltai, convened to confirm his status as Great Khan, and when he established the Yuan dynasty in 1271, proclaiming himself Emperor of China, the Chagatai Khanate of Central Asia, the Ilkhanate of Persia and the Middle East, and the Golden Horde of Russia and Eastern Europe pursued their own policies and interests, speeding up the fragmentation of the empire. Any recognition of the Yuan dynasty's supremacy over the rest of Mongol territory was nominal and paled in comparison to the consolidated power once held by the great Khans of the past. Perhaps, somewhat paradoxically, the Mongol Empire's exponential success doomed it to failure. Within 35 years of Genghis Khan unifying Mongol tribes under a single central authority, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Sea of Japan to Poland and Hungary. This vast territorial expansion created logistical challenges. Communication and transportation were major issues. Despite innovations like the YAM system, a relay-based postal system, it could take months to transmit messages across the empire. Supplying distant armies and maintaining control over remote regions placed a strain on resources and often left the Mongol administration overextended. Controlling these regions required a constant military presence, which became unsustainable as resources and manpower were spread thin. When the Mongols invaded Japan, both in 1274 and 1281, the logistical challenges of supplying and supporting a massive fleet and large army across the sea were immense, contributing to the failure of both expeditions. Also, as the Mongols expanded, they relied heavily on tribute and extracting wealth from conquered territories. This system worked well initially, as the Mongols were able to conquer wealthy established states such as the Jin dynasty in China, the Abbasid Caliphate in the Middle East, and the Kievan Rus in Eastern Europe. But while these military campaigns brought in immediate wealth through plunder and tribute, diminishing returns set in. The opportunities for conquering wealthy new territories diminished, particularly as many of the wealthiest regions like China and the Middle East had already been subdued, leaving less prosperous or harder to govern regions on the empire's periphery. The heavy burden of tribute and exploitation often devastated local economies, hampering their ability to generate future wealth. In some circumstances, local economies would no longer exist after their conquest by the Mongols. How could an economy function if it had been utterly annihilated? In 1221, the city of Nishapur rebelled against the Mongols, killing the governor Tokuchar, who happened to be Genghis Khan's son-in-law. In response, Genghis Khan asked his daughter what form of retribution should be taken against the city upon its recapture. Her answer was clear: death to all. And in April 1221, Mongol soldiers carried out her wish. Hundreds of thousands of people were massacred. Rivers of blood flooded the alleys and lanes of Nishapur, decimating the once prominent cultural and economic center. The city would never fully recover to the heights it once enjoyed. By the mid-14th century, the Mongol Empire was no longer a unified entity. Various khanates were already in decline, and soon an apocalyptic nightmare would emerge that would change the remnants of the Mongol Empire and the world forever. the Black Death. Believed to have been caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which was transmitted by fleas carried on rodents, the Black Death, or bubonic plague, was one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. The plague devastated the Mongol world, affecting its military strength, governance, and population. In China, the population plummeted by tens of millions. An estimated 33% of the population of the Middle East was wiped out. And Europe wasn't spared either, with the Black Death eliminating half of its 14th century population. High mortality rates from the plague caused severe labor shortages, and the loss of population translated to fewer taxpayers and soldiers. Administrative systems struggled to function effectively as populations dwindled and elites died. While many societies faced demographic and economic collapse during the Black Death, the Mongol successor states were uniquely vulnerable. The Mongols had thrived on the interconnected trade networks they created, especially the Silk Road. Their power was deeply tied to facilitating and taxing commerce between Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. And when these networks were decimated, the Mongols were hit particularly hard. While the Mongol Empire is often credited with fostering a Pax Mongolica, a period of relative peace and economic growth due to the stability of their rule, it also inadvertently became a conduit for one of the deadliest pandemics in history. As the Mongol world weakened, there were numerous rebellions and uprisings among the populations under Mongol rule. In China, economic hardships and social upheavals set the stage for the Red Turban Rebellions, a series of uprisings against the Yuan dynasty between 1351 and 1368. The plague had disrupted farming and trade, causing food shortages and driving up the prices of essential goods. Tax burdens on peasants, many of whom were already struggling, became unbearable as the Yuan dynasty attempted to maintain its revenues despite a shrinking population. Workers were conscripted for construction projects, despite facing severe exploitation and starvation. And corruption within the Yuan administration worsened, fueling resentment against Mongol elites. In some regions, villages were abandoned, and local governance collapsed entirely. The breakdown of social order led to widespread banditry as desperate individuals and groups resorted to theft and violence to survive, and small-scale uprisings became more frequent as communities resisted excessive taxation or local exploitation by officials and landlords. These scattered uprisings eventually transformed into a powerful movement, culminating in the overthrow of the Yuan dynasty and the establishment of the Ming dynasty in 1368. Similar turbulence would afflict other parts of the Mongol world. Timur, a military leader born near the city of Kesh in what is now southern Uzbekistan, would challenge Mongol dominance in Transoxiana, eventually establishing the Timurid Empire in 1370. And the Golden Horde, the Mongol successor state in Russia and Eastern Europe, would suffer defeat at the hands of Dmitry Donskoy, the Grand Prince of Moscow, at the Battle of Kulikovo in 1380, marking increased defiance of Mongol control. By the time the world entered the 15th century, the once great Mongol Empire had become a shell of its former self. The golden light that had once shone so brightly was being extinguished, and importantly, it had long lost one defining feature that had made it so formidable: its aura of invincibility. Military defeats, internal conflicts, and rebellions made it clear to many that the Mongols were far from the unstoppable force they had once been. Complacency, too, had set in. The Mongols were masters of mobile warfare, excelling in the use of composite bows, swift cavalry maneuvers, feigned retreats, and psychological warfare. They relied on speed, flexibility, and overwhelming force to devastate opponents. But soon, gunpowder artillery and firearms would introduce a new element to warfare. Although the Mongols incorporated some gunpowder weapons into their arsenals, notably during sieges, they didn't develop the infrastructure or expertise to mass produce and advance these technologies, as effectively as the Chinese, Ottomans, or Europeans. The emphasis on mobility and cavalry in Mongol tactics didn't align well with the logistical demands of maintaining heavy artillery on the battlefield. And so, while the Mongols were initially effective at incorporating captured technologies into their own military capabilities, their reliance on cavalry-centric tactics made it difficult to fully adapt to the evolving gunpowder revolution. By the late 14th and 15th centuries, states that effectively utilized artillery and firearms, such as the Ming in China and the Ottomans in the Middle East, gained significant advantages over Mongol successor states. The Mongol Empire's legacy is vast and complex, leaving its mark on nearly every region it touched. From facilitating trade and cultural exchange to influencing military tactics and political structures, the Mongols shaped the course of history in many ways. Even though the empire as a unified political entity was short-lived, the impacts of Mongol rule continued to resonate long after its fragmentation. So imprinted was the perception of their dominance that when Christopher Columbus made his famous voyage across the Atlantic Ocean in 1492, he was convinced he could re-establish contact with the Mongol court in China, when in reality, the Yuan dynasty had been overthrown over a century earlier. The Mongol Empire thus serves as an enduring historical lesson that no matter how great, how powerful, and how invincible they may seem, all empires eventually fall.